Freedom of choice.
A new psychological study from the National Institute of Mental Health.
Just this morning, along with longtime psychiatrist.
Circle of depression is growing wider, broader.
15% of women suffer from this disorder.
Affecting over 20 million Americans.
Changes that have occurred in the brain.
Abnormalities in the neurotransmitters.
Patient's got a problem. They've got a drug.
6 million American kids take prescribed medication.
Psychiatric care.
But what if the criminal is mentally ill? The punishment is a form of aversion therapy.
Chatting with peers on the show, but I want
Crime, OCD,
Oppositional defiant disorder.
Schools criticized for overfishing.
Everywhere you look, there it is. Think psychiatry has nothing to do with you? Think again. The whole field of psychiatry has gotten into every facet of your life.
They basically believe that everyone is mentally ill.
You smoke too much, it's a disease. You're too unhappy, it's a disease. You're too thin, it's a disease. You're too fat, it's a disease.
Where are these coming from? These are coming from the minds of psychiatrists that are dreaming these things up, writing papers and getting published with their names on it, creating these new diseases.
First he said that I had ADD. Then he said that I was depressed. Then he said I might be bipolar, but I don't have ADD anymore.
And he said, you know, I've been noticing you, and I wonder if you have it too.
What they decided is that both my husband and my son had a chemical imbalance that needed to be corrected with a chemical balancer.
There is not one shred of credible evidence that any respectable scientist would consider valid, demonstrating that anything that psychiatrists call mental illness are brain diseases or biochemical imbalances. It's all fraud.
There's no reliability of diagnosis, and there is no science. It's just pseudoscience. It's pretend science.
This is one of the most open secrets in all of America in the psychiatric field, that nothing is being done that's legitimate, and they're billing for it.
Psychiatrists claim that over 1 billion of the world's population is mentally ill. In the past 30 years, they have prescribed psychiatric medications to 543 million people. And right now, they drug 17 million school children with stimulants and antidepressants. When recently asked about the scientific basis of their profession, those psychiatrists willing to be interviewed offered nothing but excuses.
Psychiatric illness is not really illness.
How do you evaluate if someone is cured or sick?
Cure is certainly something we look forward to. We had no earthly idea how to accomplish.
We're not good at causes. We don't know what causes mental illness.
But that hasn't stopped them from pronouncing themselves mental health experts and treating people against their will. And the results?
This psychiatrist, man who's supposed to work to heal people, has done nothing but destroy this man's life, and in destroying his life, destroying the lives of all of his loved ones. Excuse me.
They've damaged and ruined my son, and they've trapped him in a system.
The way that they treated him and made him feel like he was worthless.
Bryant was being kept dumb and high on Ritalin so that they could make $2,500 per month.
He gave me Valium, and I got addicted to it.
It wiped out my life.
My life has been ruined. My joy has been stolen.
She was laying there. She took two gasps of air and died right there in front of me.
It is really tragic. It's awful. And it's being done for money. That's why it's being done.
Oh, it's got to be in the billions. I don't know the exact number, but it's got to be in the billions. It's just unbelievable.
This is so big that it boggles the mind.
Take the human tragedy you have just seen and multiply it by the millions. In the past 4 decades, nearly twice as many Americans have died in government psychiatric hospitals than in all U.S. wars since 1776. Insurance companies pay out $69 billion every year for psychiatric services, doubling the cost of medical insurance premiums. And while raking in over $2 trillion annually, psychiatrists cannot point to a single cure. Hard to believe? That's exactly what they count on. And as we will show you, it's how they have been getting away with it from the very beginning.
The roots of psychiatry have to do with control, power, and alienation from certain groups of people who were uncomfortable to be around. They were locked up in these places to get them out of the way. The history of psychiatry, I think, really is related to institutions.
Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London was one of the world's first psychiatric institutions. Commonly referred to as Bedlam, the hospital was little more than a warehouse for those deemed mad. Inmates were confined to cages, closets, and animal stalls, chained to walls and flogged, while the asylum charged admission for public viewings. In the 18th century, William Batty was the first to promote that his institutions could cure the mentally ill. Batty's madhouses made him one of the richest men in England, though his treatments were every bit as inhumane as those practiced in Bedlam, with not a single patient cured. His financial success triggered a boom in the asylum business and an opportunity for psychiatrists to cash in on this new growth industry.
This was an era where, on both sides of the Atlantic, specialized institutions for the mentally ill are beginning to be built in large numbers. Those institutions date back certainly to the beginning of the 18th century, and in a few cases even earlier than that. But the explosive growth of an asylum sector, of asylumdom, as some historians have called it, is very much a 19th century phenomenon. It's that period when the state is persuaded to invest tax dollars in building these places.
But while those who ran the institutions were getting rich, psychiatrists yet lacked the credibility to maximize their cash flow.
In order to justify their profession, they needed to come up with these biological solutions, or they didn't have any profession. The only way for them to solve that was to attempt to start believing that these people that were suffering from emotional disorders was from a biological basis.
Whatever was done to make this person more manageable would be simply called a treatment. And the sad reality is that many of these so-called treatments were, in essence, torture.
The near-drowning devices that were developed in this period, for example, must have been appallingly frightening. For example, one device involved putting the patient into a coffin, closing the lid, and dumping it into a bath of water, and then opening it up and trying to revive the patient. There were a range of these things, and the mortality rate was very, very high.
Psychiatrists next sought to give credence to their practices by cloaking them in the language of medicine. This repackaging of treatment became known as the medical model.
Somebody who's really hyper and manic, if you're wrapped up in a cold sheet and dunked into some water, you're going to quit acting manic because that's a punishing treatment. But as soon as the symptoms started to go away, they started to believe that somehow by wrapping them up and dunking them in cold water, it was draining the toxics out of their body. So they built the medical model around that.
Pushing the biological theory of mental illness a step further, an American, Benjamin Rush, put forth the idea that insanity was caused by too much blood in the head. The cure? Remove the blood by any means possible. Restraint, cold water, bleeding, even terror. And with that, a new medical model was created.
Benjamin Rush was probably the most famous American physician of the Revolutionary era. Rush was known as the master bleeder. He bled his patients for madness, He also invented something called the tranquilizer. It's a chair that looks a little bit like an electric chair. The patient was confined in this apparatus, sometimes with cold water applied to his or her head, for some hours at a time, and Rush announces in a letter that he's invented this new contraption and dubbed it the tranquilizer.
Rush's often lethal procedures were detailed in his 1812 textbook, which remained psychiatry's authoritative source for the next 70 years. He was so revered that in 1965, Rush was enshrined as the father of American psychiatry on the seal of the American Psychiatric Association. As the 1800s wore on, psychiatry's mounting failures at curing madness threatened their financial bottom line, forcing them to invent new medical models.
The cures promised were not delivered. So by the 1860s and 70s, a growing mood of pessimism was covering Europe and North America, that effectively the new institutions were ever growing in size, but not growing in their effectiveness.
The 20th century brought more medical models. American psychiatrist Henry Cotton mutilated his patients by removing their body parts, declaring this a breakthrough in the treatment of mental illness.
The earliest target was the teeth and then the tonsils and the sinuses. But when patients didn't get better, the enthusiasts for this treatment then started to move down the body and to say, well, obviously patients have swallowed bacteria in their saliva, so stomachs need to go, spleens need to go, colons need to go.
As public outcry escalated over torture and maiming of patients, psychiatrists would invent new methods, each one hailed as the miracle cure. But each one was ultimately proven no more effective nor less brutal than the last.
This is a history of psychiatry, more or less, to damage the patient. I mean, this is a version of the original model, which was to chain them like animals.
If you're doing it to somebody because you insist that they have to change, and you're going to do that by turning the screws, you might say, whether it's with medication, restraint, whatever, that's torture. And a huge part of what psychiatry has done really comes down to torture.
As the 20th century progressed, psychiatry would continue to seek legitimacy by transforming itself into a medical discipline. But they succeeded only in creating more efficient ways of inflicting mental and physical torture and death, a legacy that has carried forward into modern psychiatry, with its most profitable medical model to date, the mass drugging of millions. But to do this, psychiatrists first had to shatter one of mankind's most cherished beliefs, decreeing that people were not what they thought they were. Leipzig University, Germany, 1879. Professor Wilhelm Wundt experiments on the human senses. Wundt declares man's thoughts, personality, and behavior are nothing more than chemical reactions in the brain.
Wundt became frustrated with his inability to change behavior because he was dealing with the original, psychology. That's the psyche, that's the soul. He created a new science, which was based on man being an animal without a soul, to be trained. Not to be a thinker, but to be trained.
Students from around the world gathered to study Wundt's new definition of man as a soulless organism. The spirit of the age was summed up by German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche.
Gott ist tot. Gott bleibt tot. Wir haben ihn umgebracht.
Following Wundt's theory, a Russian, Ivan Pavlov, conducted animal experiments seeking methods to modify behavior.
Pavlov studied in Wilhelm Wundt's laboratory in Leipzig, Germany, in the late 1800s. And he experimented with dogs, with electrodes and stimulus response, denying privileges, to denying rewards.
And he noticed that when you brought out some food in front of animals, dogs in particular, that they would begin to salivate. So he'd ring the bell at the same time that he brought the food out, and then eventually, instead of bringing the food out, he just rang the bell, and of course the dogs got all excited. He called that a conditioned reflex.
Pavlov's first human subjects were children. He punched holes in their cheeks to collect and measure their saliva.
Pavlovian conditioning became one of the major foundations of a lot of behavioral science research in the 20th century.
The idea that behavior could be controlled through repetitive conditioning became known as behaviorism.
The behaviorists believed that all children are animals and can be trained as animals. This was the view of behaviorists. As a matter of fact, John Watson, the most famous of the behaviorists, says that you have to treat human beings or look at human beings the way you would look at the ox you slaughter. See, the behavior is not interested in what's up in your head or your soul, because they don't believe there is a soul.
Watson's successor, Harvard psychologist B.F. Skinner, believed all behavior could be manipulated to suit whatever ends the behavioral psychologist was seeking.
Skinner developed what's called operant conditioning, where he was able to demonstrate you can change animal behavior by certain schedules of reinforcement, by giving them rewards at certain times, and then you can teach pigeons to play ping pong, for example, and you can teach rats to run mazes, and you can teach human beings to seek certain economic or societal rewards.
Skinner could actually shape new behavior patterns, and this actually was the sort of thing he quite soon became very famous for.
Perhaps his most notorious experiment was the Skinner box.
He was designing the Skinner box, which is something like a big playpen, but everything in it's controlled. The temperature's controlled, the light's controlled, and so on. And the idea is then you present children with certain stimuli that you want them to learn to react to.
For nearly a year, Skinner isolated his daughter in a box similar to those he built for rats.
The child was stimulated and had to respond in a certain way, like a chicken or a rat in a cage, because they firmly believe that children are animals. If you believe, though, that a child is a human being, you can't train him like a rat.
Today, about $40 million a year in taxpayer money is paid out by the United States National Institute of Mental Health for behavioral psychology research. A total of $19 billion since 1948. With these funds, psychiatrists apply the same conditioning techniques developed by Pavlov, Watson, and Skinner. Case in point, a juvenile detention center where children are hooked up to 270-volt batteries and shocked in a procedure called aversion therapy.
Antoine was having a number of problems because he was up at a center that was shocking him every time he did anything. There was a button on a little, almost like a TV remote, that would be used and pushed.
They will get an additional shock for trying to remove the electrode. So they're expected to sit there and let this electricity pass through their skin without trying to remove it. If they yell in anticipation of the shock, they will shock the student an additional time for yell.
The cost to send a student to Judge Rottenberg from New York is about $214,000 per student. These students are tortured. They're given this electric shock therapy for no other reason but to inflict pain.
Other techniques include administering electric shock to treat sexual deviance, sending powerful magnetic impulses through the skull to interrupt brain activity, and shooting high voltage through surgically implanted electrodes, all to stifle problem behavior, and costing up to $100,000 per patient. And while this science without a soul led to behavior modification techniques that continue to generate billions in research and treatment, it also laid the groundwork for another psychiatric movement that would cause the deaths of millions.
January 1945. As World War II comes to a close,
the full horror of Hitler's final solution is exposed, with grotesque killing factories unparalleled in human history, mass graves filled with corpses of men, women and children, murdered by starvation, bullets and poison gas. What could drive men to commit such atrocities against their fellow human beings?
The answer is the pseudoscience called eugenics, created and promoted by psychiatrists decades before the Nazis came to power.
The eugenics movement got started in 1883 with Francis Galton, and he felt that human beings should take evolution in their own hands, and that the most talented individuals, the most healthy individuals, the most attractive individuals should have more offspring.
There was great concern that people that they considered had poor genes were reproducing faster than the people they considered had good genes.
They felt that a medical solution might be the proper one. This is what led to the sterilization movement.
It resulted in sterilization of mentally ill people, sterilization of retarded people, sterilization of people we don't like politically and sociologically. So the problem is not with genetics. The problem is a pretend phony genetics used to justify inhumane social policies.
Though never proven as anything but theory, by the early part of the 20th century, eugenics had spread to almost 30 countries, from England to Brazil, Mexico, Sweden, Russia, and most notably, the United States, where forced sterilization was widely practiced.
Eugenics movement in Germany was somewhat different than the eugenics movement in the United States in that there were many more physicians and psychiatrists. Alfred Ploetz was one of the pioneers in the German eugenics movement and how to control the population of those whom he considered inferior. In 1905, along with his brother-in-law, Ernst Rudin, he established the first organization for racial hygiene.
Alle Nationen haben sich mit einer außergewöhnlich großen Menge an minderwertigen, schwachen, kranken und Verkrüppelten abzugeben. Durch kluge Gesetze über Sterilisation würden wir auch in der Lage sein, den vernünftigsten Weg der Zeugung herbeizuführen.
Hitler was particularly impressed by American eugenicist Madison Grant. Grant's book, The Passing of the Great Race, was proclaimed by Hitler as his personal Bible. In his book, Mein Kampf, Hitler further hailed eugenics as the science that would rebuild the German nation.
Körperlich oder geistig gesund ist, dem ist es nicht erlaubt, seine Krankheit an seine Kinder weiterzugeben. Das Recht auf persönliche Freiheit wird durch seine Pflicht, die Rasse zu beschützen, eingeschränkt.
The German eugenicists welcomed the Nazi advent to power because the Nazi program could fund the very programs that they had in mind. The Nazis gave them political support, financial support, and conversely, the psychiatrists gave the Nazis a medical justification for their genocidal policies.
Something like 40% of German psychiatrists had joined the SS by 1933. They weren't forced into the SS. They just joined it naturally because the beliefs were very, very similar.
Rudin and his work led directly to the decision to move from sterilization to murder.
Their plan was simple. First, convince the public that feeble-minded undesirables wanted to escape the burden of their existence, but could not say it, and that killing them was an act of mercy. Then extend the definition of inferior to include Jehovah's Witnesses, Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, all unworthy of life. Psychiatrists produced propaganda movies known as the Nazi killing films, shown in all 5,300 theaters throughout Germany.
Geisteskrankheit ist als ein Erbübel eine der größten Gefahren für die Volksgesundheit. Irrtum ist, dass sich solche Kranken glücklich fühlen und am Leben hängen. Sie haben überhaupt kein Daseinsbewusstsein. Wer von ihr befallen wird, dem ist die schwerste Last des Schicksals auferlegt. Ein Dasein ohne Leben.
It first started with passive violence, which is starvation. It then intensified to lethal injections, and finally it developed into systematic gassing and cremation.
Their headquarters were established in Berlin under the infamous code name T4.
T4 program was named after Tiergarten 4, which essentially resulted over a period of time in the murder of about 70,000 people who were deemed mentally retarded, emotionally distraught, or physically handicapped by the Germans. They were called life unworthy of living.
The killing, piloted in psychiatric institutions across Germany, then moved into the concentration camps, with top German psychiatrists as the executioners. Paul Nietzsche, the T4 director, declared,
Das Aussortieren in den Konzentrationslagern lief etwa genauso ab wie in den Nervenheilanstalten. Und mit selbigen Erfassungsbögen.
6 million Jews died in concentration camps and as a result of Nazi extermination policies. Rudin congratulated Hitler for making his, that is Rudin's, 30-year dream come true.
After the Nazi surrender, an international court of justice was held to put psychiatry on trial for its war crimes. But American psychiatrists, fearing a permanent blow to the future of psychiatry, stepped in by shifting the blame onto a handful of German psychiatrists.
There were some doctors who were prosecuted, but very few. Ernst Rudin returned to Switzerland at the end of the war. He did not serve any prison time.
One of the strangest things of all about the legacy of Nazi science is that some of the nastiest psychiatric eugenicists at the end of the war went back to work either in Germany or sometimes in the United States.
What began with a psychiatric plan to eliminate undesirable humanity had now spread throughout the civilized world and was responsible for the murder of 11 million people. Never brought to justice, psychiatrists, as you will see, continued to advance eugenics around the world. And today we see the results. In racism, human misery, and unending social conflict.
After World War II, a new eugenics was resurrected out of the bones and ashes of the old eugenics. The eugenics movement has been at the forefront to establish a new scientific racism that justifies oppression and exploitation and racism.
In fact, racism is inseparable from the roots of psychiatry.
The entire history of psychiatry, beginning with scientific conclusions that were made in the 1830s, was an effort to prove the intellectual inferiority of African Americans.
Benjamin Rush is the father of modern psychiatry. And he is the one that gave us the term nigritude. He said that all blacks have inherited this disease. And this particular disease, it caused them to be inferior. In addition to that, it was the reason why it was very important that blacks remain segregated and separate from whites so that whites did not inherit this disease.
Asserting that negritude was a form of leprosy, Rush justified segregation as a medical necessity. And that became an argument to continue slavery.
The fact that you have brutalized a whole group of people had nothing to do with that. It had everything to do with some genetic link, and that basically you were just a diseased person. So when a slave master wanted to get rid of a recalcitrant slave, they could just say, oh, well, they're suffering from this disease.
Drapetomania, that is the name of the mental disorder that was contrived by Samuel Cartwright, who said that blacks have a mental disorder if they had a desire to run away from slavery.
Running away became such a common problem that psychiatrists attempted to give that a disease. He says, but that's a cure for that. And the answer was, the question was, well, what's the cure for that? Frequent whippings, frequent whippings. You'd be surprised how that disease clears up
when the lash is put in place of their excuses.
After slavery was abolished, psychiatric racism not only persisted, it intensified. The American Journal of Psychiatry officially proclaimed that Negroes, as descendants of savages and cannibals, were ill-prepared for higher civilization, while their pseudo-science eugenics stepped up its racist activities.
There is a clear and long and intimate connection between the eugenics movement and the Ku Klux Klan. Harry Laughlin, who was the Carnegie Institution's director of the Eugenics Record Office, had close relationship to the Ku Klux Klan through the publication of a book called White America, which was written by a major Klan leader. So Laughlin wrote a glowing review of the book in the Eugenics News, and at the same time, you have the Ku Klux Klan using eugenics to justify their racist goals.
But psychiatric racism wasn't exclusively American. Some of the worst abuses of the 20th century occurred in South Africa, where the government adopted the same racist theories and practices used by Hitler. This was no coincidence. The Prime Minister had studied eugenics as a psychology student in Nazi-influenced Germany in the 1920s.
Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd is regarded as the architect of apartheid. He saw South Africa as a divided state with whites, blacks and brown people living in totally separate areas, with black people having no rights whatsoever.
With apartheid in place, psychiatrists established mental hospitals throughout the country that were in fact nothing more than slave labor camps.
These places operated under a private company by the name of Smith, Mitchell and Company. They were saving money through the cheap accommodation for psychiatric patients while making a massive fortune out of money that Parliament had appropriated for medication. So it was a corrupt system.
When this operation was finally exposed, it was discovered that 67,000 prisoners had perished, while at the same time, psychiatrists had collected $117 million in funding from the South African government. The World Health Organization issued a report declaring that psychiatry cultivated racism and that apartheid did have a parallel in the ownership and trading of slaves. In 1971, in the United States, psychiatrist Louis Jolly West continued psychiatry's legacy of racism, hatching a secret aversion therapy experiment called the Violence Center. His government-funded plan: implant electrodes in the brains of African American and Hispanic males to shock them should they exhibit any violent behavior. And if that didn't work, chemically castrate them with drugs. When West's racist proposal met with public outrage, the plan was quickly shelved. Though psychiatry's unrelenting racist theories were blunted, they were not stopped. In 1994, psychologist Richard Herrnstein co-authored The Bell Curve, claiming to prove that blacks were genetically disabled and therefore inferior to whites.
The Bell Curve really argues a very old eugenics idea. It argues that people are born with different kinds of intellectual abilities, that these are inborn pretty much at birth. It goes back to the notion that somehow black people are genetically and biologically inferior to white people as a way to justify what was really its programs of social racism and social sexism. And you see that kind of thinking going on in public school testing and IQ testing and educational testing and tracking.
And this new tool fit into that old mold. It was a new tool that could prove the intellectual inferiority of African Americans.
The psychiatric profession has done great damage, certainly in the past, and far too many in the present, too, to subvert democracy and perpetuate racial stereotypes, even more, deep racism in society.
We have to battle against this continual misinformation, disinformation, pseudoscience. It can be repackaged in whatever form or format it is. But if it is based solely upon the color of one's skin and then is the merit of that human being, I just reject it.
And so today, the flame of hatred continues to burn, fueled by pseudo-scientific lies. This is the heritage of psychiatry, as a justification for racism and as a pretext for political repression.
Быть верными коммунистическим идеалам, убежденно, с революционной настойчивостью, претворять в жизнь ленинский завет, учиться коммунизму, трудиться самоотверженно, по-коммунистически, всей жизнью своей, утверждать на земле дело Ленина, дело партии. Клянемся!
The Soviet regime demanded absolute loyalty. Those who did not toe the party line were considered dissidents and labeled enemies of the state. With no more than a whisper to the secret police, they would vanish into one of these special psychiatric hospitals. Despite the risks, these so-called dissidents put their ideas of freedom into action.
Я вел жизнь тайную, конспиративную. Никто не знал, что я это делаю. У меня была маленькая подпольная типография. И я стал делать листовки.
While others considered themselves loyal Soviet citizens.
Я, например, считал, и то уверенно считал, что я один из лучших советских людей. Когда уже даже меня арестовали, и им написали особо опасный государственный преступ, я рассмеялся. Я при нем, при этом же самом нынешнем генерале, рассмеялся. Он меня вызывает психиатра на утро.
According to Soviet psychiatrists, they all suffered from inflexibility of convictions, a symptom of a new disorder, sluggish schizophrenia.
Вот когда добьешься, то тогда заем. Так до конца пей.
Я буду с ним. Ребят, не заставь его.
Давай пей, брат.
Like their counterparts in other countries, the Soviet psychiatrists prescribed powerful drugs to cure their patients.
Но они никогда их с удовольствием не принимают. И находят пути их не принимать. Мы обязаны просмотреть прием лекарственных продуктов, чтобы больные лекарства дошли до больного. Вот они где-то уже, как говорится, в горле проглатывают, все, ротовая полость чистая. И потом вот такие делают какие-то движения, отрыгивают.
Врач на обходе говорит, как себя чувствуете, Петр Петрович? Я говорю, послушайте, вот, там, когда 5 кубиков галоперидола, то надо, например, слюна до полу. Там перекошенность вся, значит, одни мышцы растягиваются, другие сокращаются. Совершенно ужасные позы, лицо все ужасное, на душе страшно просто. Я человека, вот самое главное, описать это состояние невозможно.
Санитары совершенно безнаказанно могли избивать. По любому поводу. Или вообще без повода. Вот, например, санитар открывает дверь, и вдруг, если тут ты оказался, например, в проеме двери. И вот этого достаточно было, чтобы, скажем, получить удар. Если больной, скажем, оказывал сопротивление при избиении, то его могли привязать, и привязывали, и избивали, и продолжали избивать уже привязанного.
Проходит, допустим, год-два, там выписывают убийц, выписывают насильников. Михаил, ты бы лучше убил бы кого-нибудь, мне бы легче было тебя отсюда вытолкнуть. Это было, вот, растало такое чувство безысходности.
From 1967 to 1987, the Soviet government arrested over 2 million people who, for political reasons, were diagnosed as mentally sick and were forced to undergo psychiatric treatment. Even today, psychiatry remains the coercive tool of choice for governments throughout the world.
What we've learned is that in Gitmo or Guantanamo Bay,
that we had teams of healthcare professionals called the biscuit teams, behavioral scientists, psychologists, working with the military to advise them on how far you could push a prisoner. There are abuses that have been documented around the world. We have healthcare professionals who have committed potentially acts of treason within their medical ethics. And there's nobody supervising that. There's nobody making them stand accountable to their medical ethics.
But psychiatrists have never reserved physical and mental torture exclusively for political prisoners. Throughout history, they have repackaged it and sold it to the public as therapy. Beginning in the 1920s, psychiatrists embraced a new group of procedures that claimed to work by creating intentional damage to the brain.
Manfred Sokal had this notion that he could kill just the bad brain cells, that somehow we have good brain cells, we have bad brain cells. So if you give people enough insulin, you kill those bad brain cells, and if the person survived this epilepsy, they would be better off for it.
Despite convulsions that caused severe spinal cord injuries in 40% of the patients, Sokal pointed to their childlike state and declared his treatment a success. Hospitals built insulin wards, and coma therapy became big business. Not to be outdone, Ladislaus von Meduna of Hungary believed he could drive out mental illness by inducing brain-damaging seizures with a drug called Metrazol.
He noticed his epileptics had no mental health problems, and his mental health patients, his psychiatric patients, seemed to have no epilepsy, and so he thought doing one would obviate the other.
The theory was that epilepsy and schizophrenia couldn't coexist in the same brain, and that if epilepsy was induced, that a seizure was caused, it would, quote, drive out the schizophrenia. There's no scientific basis for this whatsoever.
Metrazol was fast and lucrative. In a morning, a single psychiatrist could chemically shock 50 patients into a docile and manageable state. By 1939, Metrazol was so popular with psychiatrists and staff, it was used in 70% of American hospitals and in almost every other country in the world. The financial success of insulin and Metrazol sparked the development of an even more profitable method of inducing brain-damaging convulsions.
How is electric shock therapy done?
We use these electrodes. We place them on the patient's head like this, and then by means of this machine, we pass a controlled electric current through the brain, just for a fraction of a second. The patient doesn't feel it.
The story behind this miracle cure began in a Roman slaughterhouse.
In Italy, in 1938, two Italian psychiatrists decided to observe that before slaughtering pigs, in order to make the pigs more docile, they would apply electrodes to their temples that were hooked up to wall current, and that this stunned the pigs, but it didn't kill them, and they could then slaughter them. Well, this gave them the encouragement to try inducing convulsions with electricity.
We would see teeth falling out, broken spines, bones knocked out of joint, broken bones, and people even getting internal organ damage from being restrained while they were having these uncontrolled writhing seizures, convulsions.
Many patients have been returned to their homes and jobs who might still be here if it were not for this helpful form of treatment.
Having successfully sold brain damage as a cure, psychiatrists searched for even more precise ways of targeting the brain. This was jump-started in 1848, when an explosion blew a steel rod straight through the head of Vermont railway worker Phineas Gage. While Gage survived, his personality was dramatically altered. 70 years later, Portuguese neurologist Egas Moniz would try to obtain a similar result. by drilling into a patient's skull and squirting pure alcohol directly into the brain, killing the tissue of the frontal lobes. Moniz called this new procedure a lobotomy. Dr. Walter J. Freeman would become lobotomy's most infamous practitioner. He discovered he could do it faster without having to drill through the skull.
There was no anesthesia, and he would just lift up the eye and stick nothing more than an ice pick right into the brain, right under the orbital bone, and then just rake the thing back and forth until he was satisfied that he had caused enough disruption of brain tissue, and then pull it out.
Freeman traveled the country in his lobotomobile, hacking apart his patients' brains on stage, or sometimes right there in the vehicle.
And he would pull up and offer lobotomies to people, get referrals from the local doctors, or sometimes people didn't even go through doctors. They'd go right to the lobotomobile, and he would just do the brain-damaging procedure right there.
By the time his surgical privileges were revoked after his last patient died on the operating table, Freeman had performed or supervised over 3,500 lobotomies, more than 25% of which, by his own admission, left his patients in a vegetative state.
They lobotomized 1 million people in the 40s and the 50s and beginning of the 60s until they came to the conclusion that this was a destructive treatment.
But though the stories of miraculous cures were soon exposed as brain-damaging frauds, psychiatrists kept one step ahead, inventing new forms of psychosurgery, passed off as medical advances.
I completely shuddered from head to toe. And that's what I heard in my head when he drilled something in my brain.
Northwest, actually, was sent to home.
I'm sorry I had to do that.
Yeah, why did you have to do that?
I went all funny and all.
Did
My
you?
head all shook inside.
Oh, dear.
All my head shook inside.
Yes, all right.
Everything shook, my eyes, everything, my teeth.
Oh, that's well, well,
That was grievous bodily harm done to my brain. And nobody has the right anyway to play God with somebody's brain.
The whole operation took about 8.5 hours, and they kept me awake for every second of it, and I remember every second of it. And I still remember it to this day because I have this operation every day of my life. Whether I like it or not, I have it.
Psychiatrists still tout the benefits of lobotomy, a treatment that earns them $31 million annually. But in the wake of lobotomy's tarnished reputation, psychiatrists were quick to push electroshock back into the spotlight. Renaming it electroconvulsive therapy, they now give patients anesthetics to squash their screams and paralyzing agents to avoid watching the writhing of agony.
The main misconception that people have about ECT is that it's new and improved. The new and improved refers strictly to these cosmetic improvements because, in fact, they make it easier on the witnesses. The person isn't shaking all over the table. They're paralyzed now. It isn't new. It isn't improved. It is worse.
Every 10 years or so, there tends to be, first of all, a denial that it causes any harm. Secondly, an acknowledgement that it might have caused harm, but here's a whole new approach, and now this one is blameless, without any research to back it up.
The ECT machine can produce anywhere from 50 to 400 volts. It's the kind of energy that we use for industrial machinery that might be in a steel mill or a printing press, some large piece of machinery. It's an extraordinary amount of energy, and it causes a great deal of damage.
And while stories of prisoners physically mistreated with electroshock are well publicized, the amount of electricity doled out by psychiatrists for ECT is up to 33 times greater. And that damage is most often targeted at the most vulnerable. 2/3 of those who receive electroshock are women, given such diagnoses as premenstrual syndrome, menopausal disorder, or postpartum depression. Half of electroshock patients are elderly. Once they become eligible for government health care at age 65, 360% more American seniors receive ECT than at age 64. And what does this all add up to? 40,000 dead, and countless others so brain damaged they have no hope of ever recovering a normal life. For a total of $12 worth of electricity, psychiatrists in the United States alone rake in $5 billion. But the next miracle cure psychiatrists added to their arsenal made them more money than ever before. For it was faster, cheaper, and could turn every man, woman, and child into a patient for life. By the early 1950s, psychiatrists discovered their next miracle cure. A chemical originally designed to kill parasites in pigs, their new discovery hindered brain function in much the same way as shoving an ice pick into the eye socket. It was an old treatment in a new disguise.
With the advent of these new tranquilizing drugs, it seems not too much to say that we're on the verge of an entirely new era in the treatment of mental illness.
Dubbing it a chemical lobotomy, Canadian psychiatrist Heinz Lehmann described Thorazine as a simple, easy-to-take pill with the same effects as psychosurgery, but without the mess.
Thorazine provided psychiatry with the entry into mainstream medicine. It had its magic bullet. If I'm a psychiatrist and I have to spend an hour talking to someone in psychotherapy, there's only so much I can charge for that hour. But if I can come in, give you a pill, and send you back out in 15 minutes or 10 minutes, that's a much more efficient use of my time monetarily.
What psychiatrists didn't tell the public was that Thorazine caused a crippling neurological condition known as tardive dyskinesia.
And that's a neurological syndrome where you have muscle twitches, abnormal jerks, which are uncontrolled, and they either last for a long time or sometimes they're permanent. So that's very clear, very well recognized long-term or permanent brain damage from these medications.
Mr. Blount has virtually no signs of his original illness now. The signs that the movements of his mouth are completely side effects of the drugs that he was on for 20 years. Mr. Blount is quite rational. He understands what's going on. And if you're patient, he can carry on a very rational conversation with you.
Even when you remove the drug, it may still remain. It means you have caused a permanent disabling of the brain. In the late 50s, you get the first signs of it, people starting to worry about it. But it's not until the late 70s that psychiatrists start warning their patients about it. 20 years.
Thorazine's manufacturer, SmithKline French, had good reason to keep a lid on the bad news. In the first year alone, SKF saw a 3,000% return on their original investment. With the public and the press kept in the dark about the severe and disabling side effects, prominent doctors and psychiatrists met in Puerto Rico to lay the groundwork for the expansion of psychiatric drugs far into the future. Psychiatrist Dr. Nathan Klein wrote this in the conference's final report.
The present breadth of drug use may be almost trivial when we compare it to the possible number of chemical substances that will be available for the control of selective aspects of man's life in the year 2000.
Dr. Klein spearheaded a movement flooding new psychiatric wonder drugs onto the global marketplace, backed by a massive publicity machine, spending hundreds of millions of dollars. Psychiatry was now an industry of drug pushers. By 1970, the American Psychiatric Association was so dependent on drug company money that 30% of its annual budget came from pharmaceutical advertisements in its official journals.
So we had money flowing to trade organizations, we had money flowing to the doctors, and to their journals. Well, we all know that that is going to influence how they think.
The majority of National Institute of Mental Health and National Institute of Health scientists are getting more money from drug companies on the side than their tax-based salary.
With so much money to be made, all psychiatrists needed was a scientific theory to justify it. Their solution? An official report declaring that all mental problems derive from a so-called chemical imbalance in the brain, requiring drugs to correct.
This chemical imbalance is one of the greatest
fallacies ever foisted upon patients and the public. There is no chemical test to show an imbalance related to any psychiatric disease, whether it's depression, anxiety, what have you.
The chemical imbalance is for the benefit of the psychiatrist. It has to be there so that psychiatrists can treat it.
But fraudulent chemical imbalance theories could not hide the mounting evidence of common and terrifying side effects, such as akathisia.
Akathisia is like an extreme inner nervous agitation. People describe it as wanting to crawl out of their own skins. And this happens with great frequency, and it is absolutely, totally well understood to be associated with suicide and violence and homicide.
After years of these reported side effects and cases upon cases of violence, self-mutilation, and death, in 1991, health experts, legislators, and the public finally forced the FDA to order an investigation.
I know with absolute certainty that if Charles had any idea of the side effects of Prozac, he would never have taken it.
I had two sons, David Lee, age 8, Billy 16, a wife 20 years old, gone. I'll tell you why. After being on Prozac for 21 days, my wife shot and killed both of these two boys right here. She turned the gun to herself and shot herself twice.
I took the 9mm automatic, sat down on the bed, and put the gun to my head. And I blew a 4-inch hole out the back of my arm instead of my head. Thank God I was a lousy shot. Had someone looked further into Prozac, steps could have been taken to avoid it.
What was supposed to be an unbiased hearing was a panel of psychiatrists, the vast majority with personal financial ties to pharmaceutical companies.
They basically couldn't find an expert, a doctor, a psychiatrist, at a leading medical school who basically in some way or another didn't have a consulting agreement, hadn't taken money from the pharmaceutical companies.
I do not find from the evidence today that there is credible evidence to support a conclusion that antidepressant drugs cause the emergence and or the intensification of suicidality and or other violent behaviors.
500 deaths, 33 murder cases, and over 20,000 adverse side effects. Would you like to tell me why this drug is still on the market?
Is there an alliance, an unholy alliance between the psychiatric community, the pharmaceutical industry, and the FDA? And the answer is yes.
This unholy alliance became all too apparent in 1997, when pharmaceutical companies persuaded the FDA to allow them to advertise directly to the public, with psychiatrists providing medical endorsement. And in just 3 years, sales of psychiatric drugs skyrocketed, almost 2.5 times. When the numbers of violence and suicide victims shot through the roof, public outrage finally forced the FDA to issue warning labels on antidepressants. But by then, 13 years had passed, billions of dollars had been made, and psychiatrists were marketing their next wonder drugs. Over 8% of the world's population has now taken psychiatric drugs, backed up by fake science and endorsed by regulators who are bought and paid for. Their harmful medications gross nearly $27 billion a year. And while psychiatrists were finding a way to diagnose and drug every person on the planet, on another front, they were continuing their assault on our most personal freedoms. Psychiatrists demand the absolute right to determine what is best for the so-called mentally ill. After all, the mentally ill are crazy and unable to evaluate their own treatment. To enforce their authority over others and keep their institutions filled at profitable levels, psychiatrists use a method called involuntary commitment.
When you go to a real doctor, say a family doctor or a cardiologist, a patient always has the right to refuse treatment. So there is no such thing as involuntary treatment when it comes to clinical medicine as practiced by real doctors. Psychiatrists, of course, believe that people can be treated against their will.
In 1956, psychiatrist Winfred Overholser presented a plan to Congress intended to take involuntary commitment to a whole new level. The plan: purchase 1 million acres of Alaskan wilderness, build a huge mental asylum, and change the commitment laws so that anyone could be shipped off with no more than a simple nod from a psychiatrist. The bill sailed through the House of Representatives, but when the public caught wind of the plan, they became enraged, referring to it as Siberia, USA. The bill was quickly struck in the Senate. But while the death of the Siberia bill put a stop to their large-scale plans, involuntary commitment still remained the most effective and profitable method for filling psychiatric institutions.
Again, the person has committed no crime and has no trial and is sent directly to a mental hospital, which is really a prison.
How many people go to an insane asylum and say, please lock me up? Doctors don't lock up anybody. Psychiatrists lock you up.
Even children can be taken from their parents with little legal recourse.
They just invaded our home. They came in with officers. Our kids were scared. You know, they come in with pieces of paper and say, you're giving us your kids. And it's like, you know, how can they just come in and do that?
She said, you could be arrested for medical neglect. And I said, but how is that when, you know, this is my child? And I see that he doesn't need that much medication. Why would you threaten me with something like that?
At 10 p.m., 2 policemen and 2 social workers came to my house and took all 4 of my kids away.
Once committed to psychiatric hospitals, patients are drugged and restrained.
The more a person objects, the more this objection is construed as symptom of a mental illness.
At which point the person would be locked up in restraints. There would be the ankle, the knee, the waist, the head, the wrist, and the shoulder restraints. And if when that process was happening, if there was almost any resistance at all, the person then would be medicated to a point where they would almost be knocked out.
We had one case where they actually took a patient in a seclusion room and beat him up. Then they lied about it to the services that investigated. So it's a pretty wide range of abuse issues that we've encountered.
Psychiatric staff provoke their patients into violence so they can bill insurance companies up to $1,600 a day for each restrained patient.
A patient would resist diagnosis, resist treatment, and also want to leave treatment while they were at the hospital. And invariably, every time, that person's situation would be exacerbated until they were put in constraints and medicated, at which point there would be documented reasons to keep that person in treatment.
The burden of such claims is passed directly to the public in the form of soaring healthcare premiums. As for their victims, the experience is traumatic and even lethal.
16-year-old Rochelle Claiborne died in Laurel Ridge's care last August. The state report shows during the restraint, quote, Rochelle stated several times she could not breathe.
In almost all respects, the staff behaved appropriately, followed the standards.
By taking advantage of weak or vague restraint laws, psychiatrists and their staff are almost never held criminally liable for assault, battery, and murder.
He begged me to take him home, take him out of there, that they were treating him wrongly, and he didn't want to stay there. And I got a call that there had been an accident, that they held him down until he couldn't breathe anymore. I wish I would have listened to him, take him out of there before it had happened. And then I miss him every day. And I wish I could have him back, but I can't.
To this day, no one has been charged for the child's murder. The elderly are a prime target for psychiatric abuse, with treatment of senior citizens in mental institutions costing private and government insurance over $29 billion a year.
Unwarranted commitment has occurred that wouldn't have occurred if the people hadn't had insurance. The proof of that pudding is generally in how fast they get out once the insurance runs out.
Involuntary commitment is a form of psychiatric slavery, where persons are treated as if they're property and they are deprived of liberty, and people are making money in the process.
As long as we have involuntary malhospitation, psychiatry is a prison work. It's a crime against humanity. It is not medicine.
Every minute of every day, someone is involuntarily committed to a psychiatric institution. And if you think this is something that can't happen to you, or someone you know, think again. On the surface, a well-respected member of his community. But all that shattered when he was arrested on child molestation charges. Van loads of child pornography were removed from his home, and the subsequent investigation uncovered his sexual abuse of former patients, boys aged 7 to 17, who he photographed and sodomized. All part of what the state called 50 years of Barry's rampant, undetected sexual escapades with children. This is not an isolated incident. It is the carefully masked character of the members of this profession. In every city, every state, every country, you'll find psychiatrists committing rape, sexual abuse, murder, and fraud. And as you will see, psychiatry's entire credibility depends on the biggest fraud of all.
I was diagnosed with a chemical imbalance, manic depression.
They diagnosed me with having ADD.
He told me I had conduct disorder,
ADHD,
mild depression,
Major depression,
manic depressive,
borderline personality disorder,
compulsive disorder,
anxiety, depression, and schizophrenia, and depression,
sleep disorder,
identity problem, and so on.
There's no such thing as mental disorder. A mental disorder is whatever someone says it is, and if the person saying this is a mental disorder has enough power and influence, then people believe, oh, that's a mental disorder.
But you can't have power or influence without credibility. So psychiatry manufactures its own.
It's based on a grab bag of checklists for disorders that are published in a book called the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. There are no statistics in this book, by the way. That just makes it sound more scientific.
They create this cluster of disease, and they get together and they vote. Is this a disease? All in favor, say aye.
It's marketed as a scientifically based document. Now, the American Psychiatric Association, which publishes the DSM, do a lot of work to create an aura of scientific precision around the DSM, but it's not scientifically based.
Since the first edition of the DSM, the number of mental disorders voted into psychiatry's diagnostic manual has grown to 374. And with each new disorder, psychiatrists create yet another way to defraud the public.
If you have 27 ways to bill in the DSM, that's 27 ways to bill. If you have 300, that's 300 ways to bill. So you can pretty much find anyone walking on the street that could fit into a DSM somehow.
When you build insurance companies, you can't say the word. You've got to say a number. And they have numbers for the most ridiculous things, you know, like arguing with your mother or peeing in the bed.
Adolescent rebellion disorder is an official psychiatric diagnosis. Arithmetic learning disorder is an official psychiatric diagnosis. General anxiety disorder is a recent diagnosis.
For each one, there is a 5-digit code with a decimal point. Now, the implication of that is if I have illness 403.16, that's different in some important and scientifically proven way from someone who has 403.17. And nothing could be further from the truth.
Incredibly enough, while presenting the DSM to the world as scientific fact, psychiatrists freely admit its utter lack of science.
We have no diagnostic reliable markers for almost any illness there is in the DSM.
What we're testing for in psychiatry, it's hard to say because there's nothing specifically.
But as far as a test that's clinically useful, basically we're not there yet.
We don't have any laboratory tests that we can use to determine whether somebody does or doesn't have a mental illness.
There are no good biological tests for detecting mental illness.
There is no test, there's no biopsy you can do.
There is no chemical test right now.
There are no specific tests
to confirm the diagnosis or show the improvement, like any blood tests or any x-rays or anything like that?
Oh, in my practice, I don't do any tests. I just speak with people and listen to them, and then I make a decision in what kind of illness.
These diagnoses vary as widely as the psychiatrists who make them. In this hidden camera footage, a person visited several different psychiatrists, complaining of the same symptoms.
I'm extremely unorganized, and I didn't used to be. It's caused problems in the family. It's caused problems getting, I'm self-employed.
You've got ADD, ADHD, getting depressed, and your depression is bipolar depressed.
You have a brain chemistry disorder that's probably genetic.
You have a lot of the symptoms of depression.
So it seems like it is a mixed picture. What that means is like we got some depressive symptoms and some, high symptoms.
If you're bipolar, I'll need to give you a mood stabilizer. We don't know how that fits.
Considered low-grade bipolar.
You are more of the ADD than ADHD.
And as far as medications for depression, because I would recommend that you start a medication, which are Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil, Celexa.
Usually Propylene XR is pretty good.
They'll give you some Lexapro in the morning and some Trazodone at night.
Lamictal is a better medication for that. It works on your depression also.
But the treatment for any bipolar cycling is the same. The lithium.
Remeron is another one.
Trazodone.
Segretol.
Wellbutrin.
Lexapro.
Lamictal.
Equatroid.
Depakote.
Lithium.
Ambien.
You may need an antidepressant also with your Lamictal.
We don't know if I give you a medication if it is going to work or not.
To a certain degree, it's trial and error.
You never know if it's the right drug.
How many people have I cured? Well, there are no real cures right now in psychiatry.
I have cured none of my patients.
We're always challenged by our lack of knowledge.
In fact, we don't know what the causes of mental illness are.
Most mental illnesses, we do not know the cause.
Of course, it would be nice to know exact reasons of disorders, but maybe in the future.
I'm the Director of Research at the American Psychiatric Association. We don't know the etiology of really any of the mental disorders at the present time.
DSM-5 is coming out. It's grown to 10 times its original size, and it labels everybody. I could find 5 diagnoses that would fit you or anybody else.
Compare this to the research methods of pathology, a real science that discovers real diseases using a wide variety of precise diagnostic tests.
We do millions of laboratory tests as well as the structural examination and the microscopic examination. It's a whole series of applied scientific procedures. In the case of psychiatry, there isn't any laboratory tool that can precisely identify a psychiatric disease and allow it to be classified.
It's not as if there's some study of tissue or some study of the body or some study of matter. These are all categories which are made up. They're simply made up. They don't exist in nature. They're decided upon by psychiatrists and voted on.
Psychiatrists are not the only ones who benefit from the DSM. Wherever you find a psychiatric diagnosis, you'll find a psychiatric drug.
The pharmaceutical corporations now contribute enormous sums of money for the education of psychiatric residents and for the support of research by their professors, so that psychiatry today has become in America, has become very largely learning which drug to use with which disease or disorder.
We need to make sure that we understand the very close interactions among the American Psychiatric Association with its DSM, the pharmaceutical companies, who love the fact that every time there's a new edition of the DSM, there are dozens more categories in there, and so more conditions for the drug companies to say, oh, we've got a pill for that.
In 2006, a study revealed that 56% of all psychiatrists deciding what disorders to list in the next DSM had financial ties to at least one drug company. Today, we see the consequences. A barrage of drugs, each one targeted at an invented disorder that is backed by an arbitrary diagnosis found in the DSM.
The fact that it is couched in the language of science
without necessarily having any of the scientific data or underpinnings to justify it, is as threatening as anything we've seen today.
And psychiatry's latest and most expensive ploy to fool the public by imitating legitimate medicine? Brain scans.
We can scan all the brains we want to. The fact that we see changes in different people's brains, changes in functioning, doesn't mean that we've discovered anything that has its origin in the brain. It just means that we're seeing changes, but it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with the brain.
Psychiatrists and psychologists use the DSM to label 450 million people worldwide as mentally ill, a total equal to the populations of France, Italy, Germany, Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, and Russia combined. While sales of the psychiatric drugs they push have topped $27 billion annually, funding from world governments for these patients grows psychiatry $440 billion a year. And much of this money comes from the diagnosis and drugging of our most trusting and vulnerable.
We have swallowed all manner of poisonous certainties fed us by our parents and school teachers. If the race is to be freed from its crippling burden of good and evil, it must be psychiatrists who take the original responsibility.
Brock Chisholm's declaration typified the psychiatric onslaught aimed directly at our school system.
They actually said that the purpose was social control. Not to pass on knowledge, not to give him something so that he can go into the world of work.
In 1950, psychiatrists and psychologists from around the world met at the White House to propose a total reorientation of the public school system.
The White House Conference on Mental Health in the 1950s was a landmark that served to bolster the idea that schools would serve their communities better as mental health clinics than they would as institutions of learning.
In the early 60s, the world of psychiatry started to really go places in this country. Little by little, it came into our schools, our educational system.
And by 1965, it was written into law. Psychiatrists were given the green light for the wholesale labeling and drugging of school children.
A child is labeled ADD or ADHD the minute he can't sit still for a 10-15 minute period of time, or he talks constantly or ignores the teacher completely. That will get him and earn him an ADD or ADHD label.
The labeling of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, went into full swing in 1987. Within 1 year, 500,000 American children would be diagnosed as ADHD. By 1994, that number had soared to 4.4 million. In response to widespread public alarm at this apparent epidemic of mental disease, the U.S. government-funded National Institutes of Health assembled a panel of prominent doctors and psychiatrists to explain to parents and educators exactly what ADHD was.
I would like any member of the panel to describe a typical ADHD in terms of symptomatology. Mark, would you like to, since you see them in your practice?
I think the panel has been frank, and the difficulties here are immense in terms of these. It is hard. It's very hard to know how to answer this question. They cannot, even when they are as if driven by a motive. There are some good clinical descriptions. And I think, I think part of the problem is the profession keeps changing the diagnosis.
At this time, we do not have a diagnostic test for ADHD. Therefore, the validity of the disorder continues to be a problem.
But this shocking admission did not.
A terrible way to do a audit or a complaint, asking someone to DIY something when they're not a professional. It's disgusting. DIY something, you need a lawyer, you need a price water. What's it called? Price Waterhouse health auditor or something. Yeah. You expect a DIY solution, and then you're blamed if you're substandard for something that's unfair for you to be asked to do. Anyhow, here goes. I sent you the mediation because I don't have a power advocate with me. Right. Because the last one I took with me didn't note-take. Right. And she didn't note-take. Mr. Gorgas said previous to something I said years ago, one sentence out of context. We have to take this, and it's a joke. It's like the Maudsley. Seriously. Right. It was an absolute joke. So it threatened me at the mediation meeting, but there wasn't a problem because the auditor, well, not the auditor, maybe he's one of those people, the advocate couldn't advocate, but she could support note taking, because she never note took. So I hadn't allowed to stand on. Oh shit. Well, these are terrible. Do you mind if I
you want to record the meeting?
Yeah, I have to. The modern technology, wonderful.
Never works, does it?
Never bloody works. You know, you use this bloody thing. You see, what happened is the last one is.
I don't think it works very reliably. That's the problem.
It never does. So I had to get one of these things.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, man.
Hi, I don't think we have met.
Oh, we will talk in a minute.
Okay.
I have to make sure that I get up and put. My eyesight's not as good as it used to be. Okay. Let's see. Now that should work. So I just something like this, right? I leave that there. And then I put this here. It's supposed to work. Hopefully.
Maybe because it needs to be the three of us, it should be in the
middle, something like that. Okay, the way it's done is very simple. It was unfair for you to do a breakdown on what I said to you that was very simple. So what you did on a basic report was you shrunk something very simple. You used the sublime to the ridiculous. And you reduced something. You did a shrink on something very basic that didn't need to be shrunk. Right. So I shrunk, you shrunk. You did a breakdown on what I said, and I broke down your breakdown, and now it can't be broken down any further. So there is no in-between in interpretation. Now I did this in the form of an email, and did you get the email I sent?
Yes, I think the email was passed on, yes.
That was the mediation presentation.
Right. Okay, so do you want me to respond to that?
Well, I've got it in, I've got it 50 points, and I've got it, all the points that were sent to you in written form on an email, and each form there was an explanatory commentary on each point, and that was an audio.
Right.
So if you don't have it now, you can call it up on your computer.
I haven't listened to any audio. We don't take audio tapes and things like that as part of the process when we need to write.
Well, no, it's an open process. Right. It's very informal. And now I'm going to have to go through.
And then I think the problem is it's difficult to understand the audio, really. That's what we were told. It was difficult to make sense.
It wasn't, it did an MP3.
Right.
An MP3 means I used up around 3 times as much megabytes because the quality is perfect.
Right.
And I listened to it each time before I sent it. Anyhow,
I think the point about the data that was sent was that that's just the raw data on the diagnoses of patients within the trust of various conditions.
And what was the actual, where was the description come from?
It comes from the computer. It's just a description from the
No,
computer,
the actual,
data computer.
you know the way you have something like BSIA standard, and that's one description or accepted standard for looking at something. What was the standard of those mental illnesses that it came from? What standards did you use?
The standard that's used in making diagnoses, conventionally it's accepted as what's called the 10th edition of the International Classification of Diseases.
Okay, I haven't a clue about that. But yours was mental health.
It's the 10th edition of the International Classification of Diseases, which includes both physical and mental health diagnoses.
Well, homelessness was amongst one of them. How is that a disease?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure why that put it in there. It may be a descriptor that's in the international classification. It may be just another factor that was included in the presentation in addition to the diagnoses. But it isn't really a medical diagnosis, as you're saying. It's
okay. Anyway, I'm looking now. I have to go to my paperwork because if you look on the email, you will get a written account on the email broken down into points of the criticisms I have of your response, and on top of that you'll have an audio commentary in each of those, and that was my presentation. I expected you to bring that here with you today, or to access it on the
I'm
laptop.
happy to respond to the concerns that you had. I mean, I am familiar with your concerns, so I mean,
what I need is,
for me, the whole idea of this meeting is to kind of try and resolve any outstanding issues. I don't think we're planning to change the report in any way. But maybe if we explain things more fully to you, it might make more sense to you.
Might make more sense to me. Okay, the only way I could get to this mediation from Susie Payne was if I did a written critique of your response. Now, the written critique I did of your response was too basic. I had to back up what I said, so I had to explain it. So I put it forward, an email, each bit in 5 parts. 5 points of critique, and then there'd be 5 audio files fully explaining each point.
Right.
Did you listen to the audio?
No, I didn't get the audios, I only got the email.
You didn't get the audio? I sent by chance, I guessed your email account, because Susie Payne is susiepayne.WLMHT, so I just put in anthonyjolly.WLMHT. Well, I know, it was worth a try. Anyway, I told Susie Payne to forward it to you, and I believe she did.
I didn't get a whole series of audios. Did you get audios? No. We got the written concerns, but audios we haven't got.
Okay, I need to know various things. This is a load of nonsense. I'm going to have to read through this thing now and be stupid. And Dr. Karashi, let's see, is this the right one? This is terrible. This is a monster report. Oh, it's bloody terrible. How do you live with all these reports? Sure.
It could be good if we could try and focus down on the issues you wanted to raise, really.
I've already done that on a mediation
You want to
presentation. A mediation presentation that I spent a week putting together to cut down on the time. So you'd look at the points, and then in your earpiece you get an audio commentary.
Do you want me to respond then to some of the concerns?
I want you to respond to the whole mediation presentation.
Right. Well, I haven't got any audios to respond to. But
You do, because they're included in the email. You know in the email,
I've got audios.
do you know in the email when you got all the points, there were 64 points, but did you look at the email?
I looked at the email, yes.
Do you know the bit at the bottom, the 5 points at the bottom? Well, you know the bits at the top, the little squares, and beside it there's like a music symbol.
I don't think that came through.
They would have come
that?
through.
No, I did not.
They couldn't have got deleted in the email because they're part and parcel of the email. The only way they could get deleted,
When it was forwarded, it might have been.
it wouldn't have been deleted when it was forwarded.
Well, I don't recall that.
Okay, can I use that computer there?
No, I don't. We can't really do that at the moment. I haven't got my card to get access to it at the moment.
Just because you're a professor and you can't, you're a professor who knows better than the Maudsley, and now all of a sudden you came down in the last shower. Okay. It's called being stupid to be smart. That's what crooks usually do.
I mean, presumably you've got concerns you want to raise. Maybe if I could respond to the concerns that you raised, and we could have some kind of dialogue about things. Really. So I know you were concerned about the dual diagnosis, about having two diagnoses, for example.
Yeah, there is no dual diagnosis. There is one diagnosis, there's Maudsley. I would like for you to explain to me how you're not happy with the Maudsley.
Well, the Maudsley only met you once, I think, didn't they? Or they didn't for one, and I think the doctors that have been looking after you here have been looking after you for many years, and they had access to all your medical records. And the Maudsley Hospital seems to have made a decision based upon, one contact with you, plus talking with a worker who said that you never experienced any hallucinations, which was actually incorrect. So I think they jumped to a conclusion rather too hastily. That's what we think.
Okay, I have a number of them. Okay.
And unfortunately, the Maudsley Hospital made their decision about your diagnosis without any access to any records.
There's various things around there. I did this all on my presentation. Why haven't you got access to my mediation presentation? Will
I've
you
seen your emails.
Yes, will you respond? The audios are included.
Right. I'm not familiar with any audios.
I am not familiar with any audio either.
Okay, I need to know two things.
Right.
Your name is Doctor. You're 60, you've been working here for 40 years. You've been working here since 1983, correct?
1980,
Yeah.
80, I think.
1980, all right. That's not 43 years. What is that? That's 33 years. And you had around 10 years experience before you got a toolbox.
No, that was all of my experience, really, including, I was a trainee here, so...
Oh, you were a trainee here as well? I thought you trained up to the age of 30 and then you walked into a hospital or something.
Yeah, well, it can be...
I'm mixing it up.
Start working in hospitals a bit younger than that, really, in your 20s.
Okay.
But
So
maybe we could, it seems to me that the issues...
how come we never see you here? Do you diagnose patients that come in here and you?
Yes, we do, yes.
Yeah, but you singular.
Yes.
You do it singularly.
Yes. Sometimes, yes.
Sometimes, okay. What do you do at the moment? At the moment, what is your job title?
I work in two teams. One is the early intervention in psychosis team, and the other one is the Hammersmith Informed Assessment team. So in the assessment team, I do general psychiatric assessments.
Okay.
And in the first episode psychosis team, we deal with new cases of psychotic illnesses.
Okay, when you do the psychosis teams, did you set up these teams?
I did, yes.
So that means that you're an overall policy maker.
Well, in small measure, yes, you could say that.
Okay, so you set up the policy. Okay, so you're a policy maker, which means criticism of policy is something you have to deal with. Okay, I still can't find anything I'm looking for. This is absolutely terrible. I came in here with a written mediation and
Where is it then?
it's on the computer, but not
Right, you didn't come in with it, if it's on the computer.
Well, I came in with it. I came in with it sent to you, or whatever. It doesn't
I don't know whether it might be sensible to maybe, make another time with.
No, it isn't.
We can see if we can
I
find
want to
these
get this mediation
audios.
out.
We can make it another time and
Oh,
see
you
if
have
we
the
can find
audio.
these audios.
I can send it to you later on today.
Right.
Is there any point of having any discussion today about the diagnosis?
There is a big point. What is your name?
My name?
Komsky or something.
Sorry, I'm Sofia Pumaki. I'm the acting service manager here in Hammersmith and Fulham.
Okay, when you're here now, you're here as part of this complaint.
Well, I'm part of the mediation process.
Yeah.
I've been asked to attend.
So I have to attend in front of the panel. So you're not here to analyse me in any way.
It's not part of any
it's not
treatment or
it's not
anything.
part of the
It's
treatment,
just
is
really
it?
to deal with your concerns, really. Because, raise concerns about the report, so it was a chance for you to kind of describe them and discuss,
That's right.
and for us to respond to the concerns that you raised. And the concerns that, as I understood it, were to do with your unhappiness about us making a diagnosis of schizophrenia as well as one of Asperger's syndrome. And also you had some concerns particularly about the data that was produced from the computer, that it underrepresented the number of people that might potentially have a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome in Hammersmith and Fulham.
Now, I'll tell you what happened. I think the person who gave you the statistics gave you the wrong statistics. And the reason I think that, oh Jesus, is very, very simple. The reason I think it is there are only 40 cases or 60 cases of autism for the whole of this part of London. Now, this part of London is...
Well, I'm sure there are many more, but they're the only ones known to the Trust. They're the ones that are known to the Trust. Most people with Asperger's syndrome don't necessarily have any contact with mental health services.
Oh no, that's autistic in general. Oh, here, I don't want this numbers.
Yeah, many.
Absolutely disgusting.
Most of the services for people with Asperger's syndrome and autism are in the voluntary sector. So that they're not necessarily going to have contact with them.
Can I ask a question? Do you know why people bleach with a type of empathy? As if I hear your pain. But real empathy means you do something about it. So they bleach as if they hear your pain and there's a problem. And then of course the joke, they don't do anything. Okay, here goes. Various things. Number one, a social worker put me into a place where he said, I heard voices. Now, I tricked him, the manager of the place, a year later, to give me a copy of something to try to make me sign, to say I hear voices. In this bit here, he's trying to get me to say I hear voices. Now, at the end of it, there's a signature. There was a problem, I refused to sign it, and I ran off with a piece of paper. Why have you got staff lying about saying we hear voices and we don't?
I don't know, I could only go by the record really. I wasn't there. And I suppose I have to. This is a record from a separate service. This is a mental health
But Pathways is keying in to housing, and you get the information. You can't help what you do, because you can only do with the information you're provided.
That's right, yeah.
Now the information is unreliable.
That's always the problem in looking back many years to things,
No, the problem is basically companies like Pathways earn their money off open categorisation, and you should take that into account when somebody's in front of you. Pathways, by the way, Pathways is just named for move-on accommodation. It's just a council label for how they house people.
You're saying that they pushed you or maybe falsely declared that you were hearing voices because they could get more money or something from your case.
I don't know what the motivation was, but we've been trying to cram it down the throat for years. Look, there's the line saying I hear voices. This bit here.
There you didn't hear it.
Yes. And there's a nonsense here about buying a bike. And he said it was to sign a receipt. And at the very end,
the trouble with this is, you see, I don't know when you wrote this and so on, when you wrote this commentary.
The actual typing.
Yeah, this commentary of here
I
was
just did
written all
that a
over
week
it.
ago.
week ago. Yeah.
That's simple.
The trouble is, I mean, if we were to...
There's no signature at the end.
If you just said, I mean, the trouble is, you see, if we work by that logic, we could say, if you just said, I've never had a mental illness, I've never had any symptoms, we just have to then erase the entire record and say there's never anything wrong with you, it was all a big mistake. But unfortunately, the record shows that you were reported to experience all kinds of symptoms in the past, which would be consistent with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. The thing is that schizophrenia is not a type of person, it's an illness, it comes and goes. One of the things I mentioned in the report is, you may be very well in many ways now and not have those symptoms anymore. It's not a kind of person, Maybe that's a problem from the past, perhaps at the moment. But we can't simply erase the record and say you didn't have those symptoms when they're all reported in the notes.
Okay, as part of a care plan agreement, my GP has to be copied into it so she knows what's going on.
Yes, that's what should happen, really.
And there's no such thing as her being copied in late when she demands it.
Well, I suppose that can happen if the paperwork hasn't gone out in time.
But there's no such thing as years later she asks if let's send it to her and it's okay. Here I have a copy of my GP not being copied in, and you can read the various bits of handwriting. There's the GP. That's an illegal care plan agreement. And they're saying the GP is responsible for illegality because they didn't tell her.
This is a fax cover sheet.
Yes. He forgot that the fax was scanned. He thought that just the care plan went to computer. But the fax cover sheet was scanned and went on top of the care plan. And there's the illegal care
fax from your care coordinator to the GP saying that no letter was sent out regarding the care program on the 8th of November 2011. And he's enclosed the care plan.
Okay.
That's what it's a fax cover sheet.
Yeah. Okay. What he's done is everything that they were doing wrong, I couldn't prove to my GP they were doing wrong because they had to tell the GP what they were doing, and they weren't sending the GP a copy. So I got the GP to get a copy of my care plan.
You should have got a copy directly, really.
I never did.
Right.
That's all covered there. You can read all this nonsense if you want. There's this in green writing.
That's a care plan here now, so...
It's an illegal care plan.
Right.
Because Dr. Qureshi said I heard voices in, 2010, September, when Nicola Waken was there, and she can verify I never said I heard voices. And a copy of that care plan session or meeting with my doctor would go to my GP. She never sent a copy because it was a lie.
The care plan doesn't really consist of details. The care plan doesn't really consist of details of symptoms, really. It's not the right document for that. Care plans really are there for detailing the interventions that are being made by the service. So they were not necessarily going to contain information at all about symptoms of psychosis or otherwise, really.
Okay.
And there aren't any descriptions of any such symptoms here. It's really what the care plan talks about is the interventions that are being provided to you by the service. And that's listing them here, really. And who's responsible and what the hopes are that might be achieved from those interventions.
Anyhow, these care plan agreements that we go to periodically aren't simply interventions. We have to be there periodically, and we have to do it by law. So I don't know if it's debatable, it's just what the law states. Not all running nonsense. And number 3, you got this in the form of a spreadsheet. Now,
that's the information that we sent here, is it?
That is the information that you sent me. This is IC, it's 2012, it's up to date.
Right.
Now,
it's the last year, really. It's what we've got asked them to send you was the breakdown of all the different diagnoses that were made by the Trust in the last year, because your complaint said that everybody was diagnosed as suffering from schizophrenia.
Too many. Okay, it's two or three different things.
So the idea was to show you that there are a range of different kinds of diagnoses that are made.
Okay, there's various things. You got simple schizophrenia. That couldn't be 21 and that's a mistake. It was 7. Simple schizophrenia, is that even legal to diagnose that?
It's still a category within the 10th edition of the International Classification of Diseases.
But using
it's one that, there's a kind of reluctance to make that diagnosis.
Yeah, I think is it not illegal to make
It's not illegal, no.
No, but like, it usually call it slow burning schizophrenia.
No, that's slightly different.
But I mean, that's something different, but basically
slow burning is not a term I recognise in any classification. Not a term I use either, to be honest. But,
it's not a Western.
I'm not sure if it's quite the same. I think it probably, slow burning has the connotation of insidious onset.
No, that's not it. It was used in Russia.
Right. I don't know that term.
As an excuse for locking people up. Anyhow, you've got schizophrenia and then you've got paranoid schizophrenia. 1,500 there. I don't know what that you have here. All of this you got around 1,600 and all the other types. So, and then you got the mental health, blah blah blah. So you got 1,500.
Depression, anxiety, lots of problems.
Yeah. Okay, let's say you got 3,000. Now that area, is that for everybody that goes from Lily Road to North Acton to Felton?
It's everything in the whole of local services, which is the London boroughs of Hounslow, Hammersmith and Fulham and Ealing.
Okay, then alright. So that's 3,000 cases of schizophrenia. Oh, this is terrible. Here it is. The total number of autism, childhood autism, are those children with autism?
Yes, the Trust provides services for children as well.
Okay then, okay. Now, is that not picked up in education?
Oh, commonly is, yes.
Okay, so that's why there's only 14 here.
Well, most people with autism and Asperger's syndrome are not dealt with by mental health services.
Okay.
They're dealt with by the voluntary sector.
Okay. People that are adults with mental health, they weren't really...
by GPs, not everybody comes to the mental health service.
Okay. People with mental health, they weren't really looking out for it in the 70s or the 80s, they were my age.
Yeah, that's true. And it's certainly true that, people are more aware of the possibility of a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome now than they were maybe even 10 years ago.
It's not Asperger's, it's autism in general.
Autism in general.
There's atypical autism, there's Asperger's, there's childhood and all the rest of it. Now the question is as follows. Autism in the autistic spectrum is supposed to be nearly half of 1% of the population.
All you're seeing there is the cases that the Trust see. I'm not saying that's not a reliable indicator of the population prevalence of those conditions.
That's all that the Trust sees. Now, in the adult population, schizophrenia is slightly less. There's 3,000 cases of schizophrenia, and there's only around 40 cases of autism.
Yeah. That's because, the main business of the Trust is dealing with major mental illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and depression and so on. Autism and Asperger's syndrome and so on, and things that, mostly the voluntary sector provides support with. Most of the services, they're not really seen as mental illness. I mean, Asperger's syndrome isn't a mental illness, it's a developmental disorder, really.
Okay, so if you got people...
I know it's classified in the international classifications. It's seen as a developmental problem. And it's not something that, the Trust has a big role in providing for. Most of the provision for things like autism and Asperger's syndrome is in fact, in social services and local, in the voluntary sector and so on. For example, there's an Asperger's service, an autism Asperger's service available in Ladbroke Grove, which is a voluntary sector organisation, which the people that get referred to for support regarding their
will that not be counted under WLMHT?
Yeah, it's a voluntary organisation.
It's a voluntary organisation. I'm with the National...
It's not part of the National Health Service.
Okay.
But it doesn't cost to be involved. voluntary organisation
If
supported
you're-
by
if you're-
a range of bodies. It's a free service. It's not something that they charge for.
Okay, so if you're looking out for autism in adulthood, and you've been doing it for the last 20 years, how come you got 3,000 paranoid schizophrenia and you've only got 30 autism?
That's because most people with autism, as I say, don't come to mental health services. They come, they go through their GPs. They use voluntary sector organisations for services.
Do you think it's possible that people with schizophrenia, seen as diagnosed with schizophrenia, could be diagnosed with schizophrenia when they actually have autism, considering that a single diagnosis
There
of
is a
autism?
possibility of that, yes. I
If
don't
that's a
doubt
possibility-
that. And I'm sure mistakes have been made.
If that's a
in relation to that.
possibility-
Principally in relation to the diagnosis of what's called simple schizophrenia, where there are not, the kind of phenomena that one sees in the other kinds of schizophrenia, where the diagnosis is a bit softer, if you like. And you were saying about, isn't this diagnosis of simple schizophrenia illegal? Well, it is a diagnosis that we slightly frown upon and we discourage, really, because the evidence base for making a diagnosis of that type is limited. You have to make very subjective kind of judgments and so on. You don't see the hard phenomena of psychosis. And, I'm sure that there are quite a few people who've got labels of simple schizophrenia who may have had Asperger's syndrome or other kinds of autism, and may still even today, maybe. But I think in your case there seem to be other kinds of symptoms as well, which are a bit more hard-edged type symptoms, which do warrant the diagnosis of schizophrenia. And as I say, it's not a permanent condition or a kind of person. We're talking about an illness which can come and go. So because you had those kinds of symptoms in the past doesn't mean you have them now. But we can't just simply wipe out the past and say that it didn't happen, because the symptoms are not occurring now.
Okay, you made it based on admission number 1 to the hospital. How come admission number 1 is missing?
The summary is not missing. I think the admission, the first admission to a hospital was when the hospital had paper notes, didn't have the computerized notes. And I asked the people to find the paper notes, and they couldn't find the paper notes. So we had to go, they couldn't find all of them. They found some of the paper notes. They found the community paper notes, but not the inpatient paper notes. And so we had to rely on the summary of that admission, of the admissions that was in the community paper notes. But those summaries explain, the process of what happened when you were in hospital, the symptoms that you experienced at the time, and so on.
Oh, okay, it's so very interesting. What I'd really like to know is the actual mediation. For me to be here, I just can't come here on a limb and start mouthing off to you like this. I have to give you a mediation presentation with commentary on the mediation presentation. Now, I've done that all in advance, and I put a lot of work into it, and I thought it was unfair for me to have to do that. Now,
I think we've produced a report, and we're willing to discuss it, and if you want to raise, it seemed to me they were the main issues that you raised.
Well, this is the report.
Yeah, the main
That's
issues.
That's the response.
Yeah, the main issues that you raised in your response in your meeting was the issue about the dual diagnosis issue, and it was the issue about the prevalence of autism amongst the diagnosis in the trust. And I suppose what I'm trying to do is to give you some explanation of those two things.
Okay, what is your job title as a doctor as regards the head of these departments? What is it?
Consultant psychiatrist.
Yeah, but your policy maker over the psychosis teams and the recovery teams.
I'm the consultant psychiatrist for the early intervention and psychosis team here. Yeah.
Okay, could you look into the fact that a lot of people with schizophrenia I'm talking to now seem to say that they have a personality disorder. In the ebb and the flow of things, have you ebbed and flowed a lot of people with schizophrenia and recategorised them in the last few years as a personality disorder?
No, I wouldn't think so. No, not that. No.
No, and so in order to prove that, I need these stats in the spreadsheet to go back 10 years.
These are all questions that I think are extraneous to your treatment.
It is. I've only got 20 minutes left.
Yeah.
And so what I'm doing is I'm letting you talk all the talk. And now I'm going to go through this nonsense.
These things are a bit extraneous.
Okay, I need just one reassurance off you before I leave.
For your complaint.
Just one reassurance.
Right.
Susie Payne is supposed to have sent you an email. The emails...
She sent me emails from you.
Have.
And I have seen the
Been
emails.
put together with the written points, and at the very top they have audio commentary. The audio commentary was supposed to do in advance what I'm doing now, because that way it would help you do your research, and you take on board the audio commentary that was a critique of your response, and listen to that and say as to why or not that audio commentary holds up. Are you willing to look at my mediation presentation?
I'm not sure that we can. I mean, I can have a look to see if I've got any audios that I can listen to. I'm not sure that we've got the technology to listen to audios, but we can have a look.
Yes, you do actually. Right. If you have a computer, you've got the earphone jacks in there.
Right. It depends on how much time is involved. It may take some time. I don't have a lot of time to do that. But I can have a look and see what how long are the audios?
Each point, the length of the audio is usually identified at the side. I don't know. It's 25 megabytes. It's something like 15 minutes.
All right. Well, that's not bad.
Yeah.
But yeah, I suppose I'm not sure we're going to get any further than we have today.
Okay, we'll go through the points there. Okay, point number 1, second hospital admission. Why is the first hospital admission missing?
Well, there is report and record of that admission. There's no. I couldn't see a summary of that admission. The paper notes of the inpatient care you received are not available. They seem to have got.
Okay, they're not available. Okay. This point here, it feels I might have fulfilled the criteria for diagnosis of schizophrenia.
Who said that? Sorry.
It is noted that during your second hospital admission, it would appear that you might have fulfilled the criteria. Might having fulfilled the criteria for diagnosis is guessing a diagnosis. Do you just guess a diagnosis?
No. The reason I put it tentatively like that is because, as well as there being criteria in terms of types of symptoms, there are also criteria for the duration of symptoms. Okay, so what was not clear from the summary was the duration of the symptom experience. So I tried to err on the side of being cautious and not say that it was definitely warranted a diagnosis of schizophrenia, because there weren't the criteria there for the duration. I mean, it wasn't possible to ascertain it because we didn't have the paper notes reporting your day-to-day symptoms during the time that you said, but we had a summary of the admission. And there was at no point during the summary did it state how long you had the symptoms for, how long they were there for, a week, a day, a month, that sort of thing. So that's why we left it very tentative.
Okay.
The reason
I'm not even going to respond to that because you're talking too much. For the initial diagnosis matches the prescription, right? The same prescription I was on for nearly 10 years from the initial diagnosis. Now that prescription was for schizophrenia. So if that was from day one of an initial diagnosis on first admission,
entirely reasonable diagnosis.
It means that initially they had me down as schizophrenic.
They didn't initially, no.
They just gave me the prescription.
It's a schizotypal personality initially, didn't they? I think it says that in the report.
I don't know. He said it was missing. Okay.
That's what the discussion in the summary states, that the earlier diagnosis was one of schizotypal personality, and then they changed the view to one of you having a diagnosis of schizophrenia on the basis of how they saw things when you were in hospital.
Okay. It says I usual persecutory and delusional ideas that I expressed with Dr. Qureshi on the 16th of December, in which he notes, he said he hears voices in his head, and he's convinced others can hear and read his thoughts too. He said the voices are so loud that it is sure that they can be heard next door via the wall, the voices in my head. Now, at that particular meeting, Nicola Wakem was present, and she'll vouch that I've never said I've heard voices, let alone thought I heard voices in my head that were so loud the guy next door can hear.
That's the verbatim account of Dr. Qureshi in your notes.
Could you argue that the reason